Hey everybody, thank you for joining us for this important discussion about the CSU time, place, and manner policy and its impact on free expression on our university. My name is Callie McCullough. I'm the Assistant Director of the Kegley Institute of Ethics, and I'm honored to moderate this panel featuring perspectives from students, faculty, and administrators. And I'm going to introduce our panel right now and do a brief introduction of the topic. So tonight we have Anthonio Reyes. He's the ASI Vice President of Legislative Affairs, right there. Give a little wave.
It's a pleasure to be here.
We have Emily Poole Callahan. She's the Assistant Vice President for Student Affairs and Dean of Students for Student Integrity and Wellbeing. Thank you, Emily. And we have Dr. Michael Ault, who is an Associate Professor of Political Science here at CSU. So thank you, Dr. Ault. All right, and thank you all as well for being here and sharing your company with us. So as for the process of the event, I'm going to start with a brief introduction of the topic, and then we'll begin the discussion. And please save your questions. We're going to have an audience Q&A after the discussion, and we have some microphones on the side. So please save your questions for then. I'll let you know when we're going to be doing that and be ready for that. All right, so here we go. The CSU system has long upheld the values of free expression and academic freedom, recognizing that universities serve as vital spaces for debate, learning, and the exchange of ideas. However, the recent changes to the CSU time, place, and manner policy have raised concerns regarding the balance between free speech, campus safety, and administrative oversight. The new policy introduces more restrictive measures compared to previous guidelines, prompting discussions about how these changes affect the ability of students and faculty to engage in expressive activities without undue limitations. Our discussion today will delve into these topics, seeking to understand how this new policy is being implemented and what it means for students, faculty, and campus life. We will examine how the university can uphold free expression while maintaining campus safety and order, and we invite our panelists to share their insights on how best to navigate these challenges. So I'm going to start us off with the first question, and just going, not picking you on purpose, but just going because it's the first question on my list for Emily. This new policy distinguishes between public, limited, and non-public spaces on campus. So how does this classification affect where and how students and faculty can gather for expression?
Sure. I think the one thing that the policy does, and if you guys are familiar with it, the CSU as a whole developed the interim system-wide time, place, and manner policy and provided some specific guidance and guidelines and distinguished between what public areas, limited areas, and non-public spaces are. However, they asked each campus to really specifically address all of the campus locations and facilities on their university and specify which ones in an addendum. And so what you'll see on the website is both the interim system-wide time, place, and manner policy and then the CSUB specific addendum. And so for public area, it's listed as university property that is available for public assembly, marches, demonstrations, protests, and a debate. I would say this is really specific to outdoor locations. And it's the right of access and equality of access are provided in these areas so long as activities are lawful and do not disrupt university operations. And so some of those locations, it specifies in the addendum. No, we were talking over here, we're not as tech savvy over here as if Antonio has an iPad. I have all this printed paper, so bear with me. But for public spaces, as I mentioned, it really talks about any outdoor location, the Student Union Park, Red Brick Road, Runner Park, and some of the more limited areas is university property available to the public, but due to business operations, safety concerns, or other important university interests, it's not necessarily open for assembling, marching, demonstrating. And activities in those specific areas are required to be reserved through what we know as our 25 Live software system. And that's just so we can ensure that programs and events that are already scheduled are reserved, and that we can ensure that there isn't overlap and disruption to the other operations. And so some of those locations that you guys may be familiar with in terms of limited are like the Student Recreation Center, the Solario, the gym. Some other limited areas are listed as like the Student Housing MPR or the Student Union MPR. And then all other locations, when we talk about non-public, are like our offices or our buildings or our classrooms, those spaces that are not able to be reserved or are not typically used for events and programs. Does that help?
Yeah, that was awesome. Thank you. I think that helps us think about, where this applies on our campus, and as we go forward, what we need to think about when we're expressing ourselves in different areas. So awesome. Thank you. Okay, so our next question is for anyone on the panel. And so the policy states that speech must not disrupt university operations. So how do we define what constitutes a disruption, and who gets to decide when that definition is met of a disruption?
Well, I think when the policy was being made, students weren't taken into that conversation when the policy was being made. So I think right now, the way it's set up is the administrators have that designation to determine what is and what is okay.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't okay.
Yeah.
I would just follow with what Antonio mentioned. And I think that's one of the large criticisms that's been expressed by opponents of this new policy, just the lack of consultation, whether that was with faculty or students. I think it's interesting, though, that there is a history in this country of defining what disruption is and what it means to disrupt. And these court cases go back many, many years. And in fact, I think some of them you might even be familiar with, the 1971 the draft, which was a jacket that was worn inside a courthouse, California courthouse just down in Los Angeles. And the court had to decide what constitutes essentially offensive conduct. And their definition at the time was fairly specific: a direct threat of violence, a direct incitement to illegal action. That was also argued in the Brandenburg case in Ohio. And also the significant disruption to public order, which essentially leaves open, again, the question as to what is that. We also see these cases in the 1980s, late 80s, with the flag burning case, the Johnson or Texas versus Johnson case, in which the court reaffirmed that burning a flag is a form of expression, it's a form of speech. And then, of course, in the Snyder versus Phelps in 2011, some of you might recall the Westboro Baptist Church, and they were protesting military funerals. These were funerals for active military duty members who had died in Iraq or Afghanistan. And of course, their protest was the United States was, essentially, it's Baptist Church in Westboro, Kansas. The United States was going to hell for tolerating homosexuality. Surprisingly to some, the court reaffirmed that this group did have that right. And leaving many sort of in disbelief that, well, if military families who are grieving their loved ones aren't protected from this form of speech, how do we deal with this? So the court over the years has emerged with what's known as sort of the content-based versus the content-neutral rule. And the content neutral rule is something specifically mentioned in the time policy manner policy of the CSU, which essentially says that any sort of regulation, if you will, that can take place cannot be done because of the content of whatever potential disruption. And later, as we see in Healy versus James, 1972, Popish versus Board of Curators in 1973, courts ruled that universities specifically cannot use potential disruptions as a pretext to suppress speech. So this becomes sort of a question for me as I'm reading this, when I look at some of the restrictive provisions that we see in this time policy and manner policy, namely the big one, the first one, campus access, the times at which this can be done. There is a stated time, I believe it's 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. now. 6 a.m., sorry, in the TPM policy. But it also addresses, and some of the provisions address things like face coverings. And we've seen that the Faculty Association, some students have spoken out against this. The Academic Senate, which represents the faculty, have spoken out against this. In terms of how do you determine that? Does that include religious people who wear a face mask for religious reasons, people who may be immunocompromised, so on and so forth. And the other aspect is the posting of materials. And this one I think is especially gray in the policy. And that is prior written permission is required for posters, signs, banners, and even chalking on a sidewalk, if you will. This type of pre or prior written permission raises a lot of questions. And I think the question that you're asking directly, which is who makes the decision as to whether or not the message on a banner is going to be disruptive, essentially lies right now with the administration. And there may be processes, it seems, there may be processes involved for you to appeal this. But as anyone who's engaged in activism of any sort knows, that oftentimes these events are organic and they're spontaneous and they come out of deep-seated passions. And to think that we can take a bureaucratic process and tame that passion and not make those worse is, I think, just naive. I think there's better ways of doing that. So disruption as a concept, I think, has precedence. But at the same time, given the circumstances, not just in terms of this policy, but what we've seen over the past year, especially past year and a half, campus protests nationwide, and presidents in particular paying high costs, losing their jobs in the case of Harvard, in the case of Columbia, in the case of MIT, being called to campus, being called to Congress to justify and explain your policy. So the one nice thing I would say about the policy is I can understand from an administrative standpoint, given the political context, not today's, that's something different. That's an added context. But given the context of the past year and a half, I think it's smart for an administration to clarify, or at least attempt to clarify, so that they have something to back up on. However, I think that also opens up another can of worms that is essentially challenging, potentially, the very nature of what a university is, which is the exploration of ideas.
And that is why we're here, because it's difficult, right? Emily, did you want to say anything about that?
I think to answer from my lens in terms of the policy states that speech must not disrupt university operations, and how do we define what constitutes a disruption and who gets to decide. I will mention, as part of the addendum, there is what is called a university response team. And this was, again, asked of all universities as part of the addendum to identify individuals who are administrators on the campus to be able to be knowledgeable about the policy and to be able to provide information as it relates to the policy. And so if there are questions that these individuals would be available to consult with or discuss concerns. As it relates to disruption, I think what we understand that reasonable standards are developed here, and I think that that's the difficult part, right? Because it's individuals' reasonable standards. However, we do recognize that there are certain situations that are cause for disruption, which would, as you mentioned, in terms of inciting violence or a direct threat. In addition to making sure that there isn't a violation of our non-discrimination policy. And so if there's issues as it relates to sexual harassment, sexual assault, discrimination, those types of concerns that are protected under the non-discrimination policy are also would be considered disruptive. And then in the general sense, when we think about classroom activities that are happening, having an event right next to a classroom where the professor would be unable to continue lecturing or conduct university activity, if that would be considered disruption. And again, having the university response team or partners being able to address those concerns that come up. And lastly, I'll just say, purpose of having a scheduling software like 25 Live is to understand what's happening on the campus and making sure there isn't disruption within programs and services. And, student union is pretty active, and the student union patio is pretty active. And so they would have to take a look at programs and events. Is something happening or scheduled in space, and not having another program or event or a protest or a demonstration that would disrupt the already scheduled program and activity. And so those things are monitored through the 25 Live, but also the university response team.
Yeah, so some sense of organization. We've had 25 Live for quite a while to organize. Yeah. So I can see how it's helping with this as well. All right, so let's go on then. I guess, Antonio, I'll give you some time here with this question. So many student organizations rely on protests, demonstrations, and spontaneous gatherings, as Dr. Ault also mentioned, as part of their activism. How does this TPM policy impact student expression?
Well, I think ultimately this policy limits students' ability to express their First Amendment. When they're responding to life events around them and they want to express their concern about something and they're trying to do it in real time, this policy makes it difficult and adds a lot of bureaucratic red tape that limits students' ability to do that in a spontaneous way. So something that happened on a Monday, students would have to put in a 2-week request in 25 Live, and so they wouldn't be able to do that week or even the week after. And at that point, the impact might be lost.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. I want to ask you, has this come up yet at all in your experience, having to go through 25 Live, but it's okay if you don't, if you can't.
We had a solidarity march on campus a couple weeks ago, and I know that the student organizers had some trouble in communicating with the administration about what was okay and what wasn't. They were getting a lot of go to this person or go to that person. And so I think there's a lack of clarity on campus as well regarding the policy that also makes it difficult for students to demonstrate and express their concerns.
Yeah, absolutely. With any kind of new implementation of policy, there's going to be a buffer period, right? Where everybody just has to get their ducks in a row. Yeah. Okay. So.
Do you mind if I?
Yes, please. Yeah.
I find it interesting too, because even though, and I've seen the addendum of all the different places on campus, and in one way, it does codify where these things can take place. So in some sense, good job. As a professor early on in my career on this campus in the early 2000s with the invasion of Iraq, anti-war efforts that were going on this campus, as small as they were, we were searching for this designated free speech area.
Mm.
And no one in the administration that we talked to could even locate it, much less, I actually point to and say why that's the place. So in that sense, I think now that we've opened up the campus and identified these places, that's a good thing. However, at the same time, as Antonio mentions, if that then hinders you in the process, that seems to be counterproductive as well. At least with a designated free speech place, anyone could be there anytime saying whatever they want, and there was a place that was protected.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, it's interesting. I can see like the pros, and then also how this might play out as students want to organically, gather and have things happen. How it might be slowed a little,
Right.
and we want them to have the opportunity to have that experience. Yeah.
Definitely.
Okay, so on to our next question. This is for Dr. Ault and Antonio specifically, but Emily, of course, if you want to add on, you're welcome. What are the biggest concerns regarding the enforcement of this policy? And have there yet been any instances where you felt the policy was applied unfairly or inconsistently? So biggest concerns about enforcement and any instances of unfair or inconsistent enforcement at this time.
Well, at CSUB, we really haven't had many demonstrations on campus that really fall in line with the TPM policy. But we did have, again, mentioning the Solidarity March, there was an instance where they were trying to have drums that were going to be played by a group there. And they were told they couldn't have sticks to hit the drums with because that's against TPM policy. But I thought that was inconsistent with other programs we have on campus. For example, concert band. They're not taking away the drumsticks when they're playing their instruments. And so I thought that was odd that they would not let them play their drums at the march.
Mm-hmm.
Fortunately, this hasn't happened at CSUB as well, but I know at CSU San Marcos, a student was also terminated from their position from student employment because of their role in a demonstration there that technically violated TPM policy. And so I think it's a mistake of the administration to be able to decide when and where they can enforce the rules. And then if they're not agreeing with the message of the demonstration, then retaliate against the student.
Yeah. So that gets into a little bit of what Dr. Ault was talking about with the content neutral. But I wanted to ask, was it the university response team that responded about the drumsticks or?
Again, I'm not too sure.
Not sure? Okay.
Yeah. I think it was, again, the mixed messaging between administration.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. Dr. Ault, do you want to?
I don't have any specific examples,
Right.
but I do think that the enforcement of the policy or the implementation of the policy really opens up, and I think we see this in the critiques that the Faculty Association, for example, has made, that it opens up the potential for discriminatory enforcement. So going back to the issue of disturb, who's to determine what sign or what message or what issue is going to cause a disturbance? And I mean, if I were to try to organize a rally that said something derogatory about the institution, and this applies specifically to labor rallies, faculty rallies around labor rights, are those potentially disruptive? Well, in a sense, and I'd say this about a lot of different type of, especially activism, they're meant to be disruptive. That's the intention, is to stop the ordinary order of things, to get people's attention that aren't necessarily thinking about that issue, and to raise awareness. Now, we could debate whether or not these are the most effective ways to do that, but that's a separate issue. The fact that campuses since the 1960s and the battle for free speech in the 1960s, specifically here in California, Berkeley, and other campuses, we've seen a long tradition of freedom of speech tied to the academic freedoms and the purpose of the university itself.
Very true. So as you were talking about these things, I was curious if any of you know, is there a way that we would ever hear about people who want to demonstrate who are either denied or delayed, or if they actually do violate the TPM policy? Is there any way that that's publicized, or is it just case by case and it's done privately? I'm just curious, how would we know and be able to think about inconsistent application if
I would say that, I mean, this policy does address violations would go through a student conduct process, which is under my purview with the Dean of Students Office and the student conduct process. That's a policy, again, within the CSU. Our campus, and I guess I can speak personally to this, we are in an educational institution and take an educational approach. And so although students have a right to privacy, we don't publish anybody's student conduct record. It's their private right to keep that protected. I would just say that if there was a violation, like, we would address it through an educational conversation or process. And every case is different. Every case is unique and individualized based on the circumstance and the situation. So it's very hard to speak to a generalized process of what would happen or how that would be, how we would navigate that.
Yeah. Oh, you go ahead.
Go ahead, you're good.
Oh,
Go ahead.
well, I was going to ask a different question. So if you had an add-on.
I'm just curious. I mean, is there, aside from violations of the policy, just how many student groups or faculty groups petition each year under this policy? And when you see the decision that they were denied or that they were agreed to, and is there a place where we can see that?
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. Where's the data, right?
Right.
Yeah, I don't know that I mean, I don't personally have that data, and I just realized here I'm representing administration. No, I'm just joking. I knew I was. But as we were talking about administration and the barriers, oh, that's me. Just joking. But no, I don't have access to that data. I don't, wouldn't know who would necessarily have access to that data. When this first was published in terms of the addendum for our campus, the chief diversity officer, who's no longer at the university, was listed as the contact person. And now it's our vice president for people and culture, Lloyd Lodorn, who's in the audience. And so I doubt, I haven't heard of any processes where we're tracking that information, but it does bring up a concern, as Antonio talks about this most recent example, that is a demonstration and a march that should not have had to be required to go through a 25 Life kind of process, that what those concerns and issues are, how do we fix that and how do we address it? How do we protect and support and encourage the free expression of ideas and thoughts and not have these bureaucratic processes that inhibit students and our faculty and our staff and our administrators from being able to demonstrate or protest or rally. And so I would just say that why don't we use this as an opportunity to sit down with ASI and the university response team to say, how can we fix this on our campus? We're small enough. We know each other. We work well together, right? I think we like each other. How can we really come together and identify how we can make this work for everybody?
Yeah.
I would just second and say, I think also having a list like that is accessible and transparent could reduce the amount of issues that people encounter and possibly even get at some of the rumors. Well, I heard of this group that was wanted to do this and they were denied. I just think that would be a smart thing to do.
Yeah. So kind of piggybacking off of that, my next question is again to you, Emily, and it's, I think, a good transition over to, so when we have a disruptive situation on campus, what steps should university administrators or the university response team in particular, what steps should they take to address those disruptive situations? And how can we ensure they're upholding free speech in particular while also trying to keep order?
Well, I believe in relationships. I believe in conversations. I believe in the power of people coming together. I believe it's critical that conversations are had prior, if possible. It's not always possible, but to ensure that people are on the same page. If there's a concern about disruption, I think the conversation with the person to discuss policy purpose, remind them about their rights. It's not just about following policy, right? It's also about the rights of individuals to express their ideas. And so I hope that that's articulated enough in both the policy and our addendum that encourages and supports and values free speech, and not just that it's a policy that prohibits or discourages or limits. And so I think, again, as I stated earlier, we're an educational institution. I think education should be at the forefront of these conversations. I don't think it should be law and order necessarily, but really how can we learn through this process? And I don't know, I learn every day from all of you. So I think the conversations and relationships are critical. I think free speech is everyone's right. It should be protected. We have to ensure that we're protecting people within the institution and the system and campus, and have developed clear guidelines, but also respecting everyone's right to free speech. And so I would just hope that how administrators take steps is by continuing conversations.
Yeah.
I would just add I guess it's the other element here, the elephant in the room, which is that we may have on our campus, or even possibly within the CSU, a well-intended policy that tries to protect all of these very fragile and delicate and complicated concepts. But at the same time, we have a massive shift that's occurring in this country in terms of what is free speech and what is protected and what's not protected. And the events that we've seen just since January with students being apprehended, not by campus police, not by administrators, not by faculty, but by outside police forces that are coming to that campus to bring that order, and what effect that has on this entire process. So again, in a sense, I see from an administrative standpoint, I can understand why you would want to be able to point to, look, we have things in place that make that unnecessary for you, the federal government, to come in and make any changes. But at the same time, I can also see how that policy can really start to get at and begin to look like, to some people, the bigger elephant in the room, if you will.
Yeah, I know the times that we're in.
Yes.
Yeah.
And just to be clear, if you don't mind, I mean,
Yeah.
we've seen students at UCLA, student protesters, a student protester is now being deported. We have a student at Columbia who is protesting, now being deported. We have individuals who have gone in their research capacity to other countries and been flagged as they come back, being redeported. This was a Brown University faculty member. So these events are real and they're happening around us, and there's others that I just didn't mention. but they are real. And,
Yeah.
and I think it raises the importance of a talk like this beyond this campus and beyond the CSU and really into that, the national dialogue, because in many respects, there's a large portion of the country that looks at universities as promoting things like anti-Semitism and death to so-and-so and death to this. And I think that the university in this era is in a precarious moment altogether.
Yeah, absolutely.
So-
Feel that. Yeah.
Yes.
I'm curious if the intention behind, we can't answer this right now, but just a thought, if the intention behind the TPM policy also was to have that kind of protective factor from outside forces, because we can handle it in-house. So we don't need,
Right.
Yeah, it's an interesting thought. Yeah, thank you. Before I go on, did anybody else want to say anything?
I just wanted to add one thing. I think
Yeah.
the TPM policy might be seen in the way you just described, but I know at San Marcos, for that demonstration, they pulled outside
Right.
outside police forces
Yeah.
to subdue the demonstrators. So I'm not sure
Right.
that, it's not doing what they say it does. Yeah.
That's how it goes with the policies, right? The intent is one thing, and then the implementation can be another.
Right, exactly.
Okay, so this will be for everyone on the panel. It's my last question that I have for you before we get to the audience. So given the evolving nature of campus discourse and student activism, do you think the current policy strikes the right balance? And what, if any, changes would you propose to better support free expression and open dialogue? So any improvements you think that could be made to the policy is pretty much.
I think as the policy as it stands, and I mentioned it earlier, but they didn't talk with students about when designing the policy.
Right.
And so for that reason, I can't say that it is balanced.
Mm.
I think going forward, if there are any revisions or changes to the policy, as the representative for student government, I believe in shared governance, and I think there needs to be that student voice in that room when making these decisions.
Right.
Without it, students are always going to be left out, and there's going to be things that students don't agree with the policy.
Yeah, that's definitely something, Emily, you were echoing, communication and giving people voice as part of being in an educational institution. Exactly what you said.
Yeah, my understanding is there was an open response period of time for people to engage with concerns related to the policy. And they received a number of questions. And again, I should have done my research, but and not just highlighted all these things. My understanding is at least one of them, as it related to face coverings, was addressed and amended because there was great concern about trying to control what people wear, whether it's religious or health, as you mentioned, and concerns, and so, or personal choice. And so I do believe that was amended. I don't know if that open dialogue process is still open.
Mm-hmm.
My understanding it's also still labeled as interim because there's still a period of review with CFA.
Right.
And so my understanding also there is that there is an opportunity to engage in questions and comments and recommendations. And I think that as individuals who have those questions and concerns should express those and hopefully go through that process to be heard.
Yeah, so the policy today could be different tomorrow, right?
Correct. Yeah.
It's not set in stone.
I would just add to that in terms of if it's the right balance, I do think without the consultation, it's imbalanced. However, having said that, at the same time, I think that the university and universities in this country, even worldwide, we could think, are these places in which should be places in which freedom of speech, academic freedom are sacrosanct. These are values, and I think that vision of the university competes against what we could either think of as practical reality or what sort of I've witnessed and I think has occurred in the university system is becoming regimes of liability. And so that they're so careful not to do something that could be innovative or do something that, you know, allow a voice that could be potentially viewed, you know, as vulgar or even potentially disruptive. And so finding that balance, I think, has always been in university, you know, this struggle, this conversation, this dialogue, the dialectic, we could even call it, between these forces that are operating. And I'll just end with the idea that keeping that conversation in context. At the same time, we're seeing cataclysmic shifts in the way the universities are going to be treated, at least for the next 4 years. And that includes everything from research grants to what's said on campus, and far be it, even though we may accept that that is acceptable here, potentially it's not acceptable to someone else. All of those questions, I think, need to remain in the balance as well. And ultimately, I would like to see this policy be something that, I mean, we live in a world where everything is instantaneous. To wait 2 weeks to find out if you can have a rally about an event that's happening right now, I think can backfire. And instead of creating administrative barriers, we should be sort of encouraging people, you know, to, yes, you know, go through the administrative process because you can still achieve what you want to achieve, and have the protection and liability coverage essentially of the university.
Yeah. We need to see how it plays out. Right now we have all these, you know, concerns and you know, intentions. We need to see like actually be applied, I think, to work out those tricky details. But it is a precarious time, as you mentioned. And I do like that term, regimes of liability. You should, you know, copyright that. Okay. So that is all the questions I have for our panelists. So now I'd like to open it up to the audience. If you have thought of a great question you have for our panelists, we have 2 microphones on the side. So please feel free to jump up and fire away. Is it on? Okay, it should be good.
Sure.
Great question. Thank you. What was your name?
When the policy was provided to campuses from the chancellor's office, they provided a template, if you will, for the addendum that really specified, they called it this, the university response team, and asked campuses to set operating hours for each individual university, and also list all university properties. And so that's what the addendum states. It is on the current TPM website. And right now, I just was looking at this. I might ask Antonio to look at his computer right there, because I don't think it has everybody on here. I don't think the one that I have is the most. I don't think it's the most accurate. So I'm going to see if Antonio can pull it up. But it is administrators that represent a multidisciplinary units and areas across campus, and who can be available to assist, again, who are knowledgeable about the policy, can assist individuals if they have questions about it, and help, not to prevent, but to help with free speech activities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Sure.
So if anybody on the live stream didn't hear the question, it was who constitutes the university response team? But that is a great question. I wonder, who is on there? Are they volunteered? Are they appointed? What are the nuts and bolts details, I guess?
I think it's one of those voluntold roles as
Voluntold.
administrators, right?
Okay.
It does state that the response team for matters related to implementation and enforcement of the policy and addendum. Again, I don't know. Antonio's looking at it right now. It's the same as the one that I have. I'm not sure if they specified that it needed to be administrators or not, but I will take a look at that and get back with you on it.
Yeah, that might be something that just needs to be worked out on the implementation, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
And ultimately, if I'm understanding this policy correctly, reading it correctly, ultimately, CSU administrators would have to decide, for example, like a sign, if this sign is allowed, they would have to decide who is the sign targeting. So if it is potentially provocative, is there a person being targeted? Where is it displayed? Because it's a big difference between having a 20-foot banner in front of the library entry and having it out in a courtyard somewhere. And then also whether it incites immediate illegal action or violence. And I think that in most of our minds would seem fairly straightforward, but it also can get tricky if someone's yelling death to fascism, is that potentially a violent incitation or an incitation of violence?
Mm-hmm.
So I would second what Dr. Case has mentioned, that having faculty, having at least representatives from students and faculty on that group to help make those decisions, again, it just brings the legitimacy of those decisions to a much higher level than they would otherwise.
Yeah.
I'm wondering whether CSU what are they having mechanism on how we understand the protection of the law? Each unit is very the officer was going to get more individuals from different fields perspective of how to interpret the law. I'm wondering whether there is some kind of a training of the administrators of each CSU. They get together and they try to figure out exactly how to interpret the policy. Those are the nots, the shoulds, not. And how, part-time changing.
The policy, so in addition to the policy, the addendum that was asked of universities to create, there also was an opportunity for campuses to submit educational plans to the system to provide opportunities for learning through this process. And so since the implementation of the policy, we've held a couple sessions as it relates to addressing the time, place, manner policy. I feel like it's me.
No, I think it was, that one's not working, but I was wondering.
It's the
Maybe this,
administrator.
Yeah, that one does work.
And so part of that, the TPM educational plans provided these educational forums, which this was part of that also. The focus, because it's still considered interim for faculty and not fully approved and vetted, there wasn't a focus on the educational opportunities with faculty because it's still going through that process. We held a forum with students, and then our management personnel plan, which are MPPs on campus, we're considering developing what Fullerton has, which is called a quad squad. And so these are just like the university response team managers who are knowledgeable, about the policy and can provide support for people who want to engage in free speech activities. And again, not to just focus on the what you can't do, but what can you do and how do we support you and how do we help you?
So just to follow up in case the live stream didn't hear it, it was, are there trainings currently for administrators or people who respond to TPM violations or anything like that? And so just at this time, there's no official training. Would that be the answer, or there has been some?
Yeah, we've conducted some. I mean,
Okay.
I wouldn't say that there's an ongoing schedule of trainings that are available currently. There will be ongoing opportunities to engage in this and in the policy and the work and the conversations. And I'm not just saying this because I'm on a panel talking about this, but I also would hope that through the information that Antonio brought up, that as a university, we can sit down and talk about the concerns that happened in real time or what happened recently, so we can address them and see how we can prevent that from happening moving forward.
Yeah. Thank you again for going over that. Do we have another question?
So let's lower that. Hello, my name is Marcella. I'm a business student here at Cal State, but me as well as Victor, who stands behind me, we were one of we're the two coordinators for the Students in Solidarity March that we've had here on campus, and so we have a couple of questions. My question, and specifically, is about the free speech areas that we have on campus, right? I have a very strong opinion about that with regards to, for example, we pay our tuition, right? We're not strangers to this campus. This is our campus. And so we feel like it's only right that we're able to use our campus the way we want to, right? And so I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that. And I know you spoke on it a little bit, but I would like to hear more on if you think that these free areas are justifiable, or if you think this in turn affects our free speech rights.
So you're asking me, right?
All three of you, or whoever
Okay.
wants to answer.
So the question really is about, are the current public spaces that are deemed as free speech, is it enough?
Mhm.
Is that the question in terms of making sure that we are, as a campus, together agreeing that these locations are, so I'm going to ask you a question, so stay up there. Okay. My understanding is that there was a time where this university wanted to designate the student union patio as the free speech area. To Dr. Ault's point, right? There was like this designated space on campus where it's always available and always open for free speech activity. And there was a lot of pushback on that, saying like, why is it only this space? You can't limit me, right? Because this is a public institution, and therefore these public spaces are free speech spaces. And that is true. And so having this addendum that identifies that all public spaces, outdoor spaces, are considered free speech areas or are available for protest marches and demonstrations, and reservable for events. I guess my question back to you would be, what other locations would you want to see? And how can we, again, open up dialogue and have that conversation about what would be a more desired space for public space?
I guess my concern is without reservations, right? Without the use of that, shouldn't we be able to use all, aside from classrooms, but all public spaces for our free speech, instead of having to calculate these certain free areas that we were told about?
And again, to understand, are you saying not having to go through this reservation process? Is that kind of the concern?
Yes, yeah.
My understanding, I see Ed in the back, I'm not going to put him on the spot, but my understanding is that you don't necessarily have to go through a reservation process to conduct free speech activity. However, we ask as an institution that you are talking to us about what's happening so we can address if there are events being reserved, if there are situations that are already scheduled. And so we prevent disruption from happening. So let's just use an example of Alumni Park. Alumni Park is an outdoor location on campus. It's reservable for programs and events. So say there was a graduation ceremony or program that was scheduled in Alumni Park, and there was a free speech demonstration, protest activity, rally, which is, again, we want our campus to engage with. If there was a conversation, at least, to say there's an event happening there, can you avoid walking through that space because it is a public space and it's available, but because there's an activity there, can we avoid that disruption? So that's my understanding, and maybe that's not been clarified completely.
I mean, it's a good point that you bring up. I think just to follow up on that, if I can, is just the fact that I think, sorry, I forgot his name, Dr. Ault. Yes.
Michael.
Thank you. So I think he brought up a great point, is that sometimes you need that disruption, right? Sometimes, and maybe I'm misinterpreting it, but this is what I think has some troubles and difficulties with the reservation, is that sometimes there is a point to the disruption in our daily routines and certain aspects of our daily activities here on campus, that sometimes we need something to disrupt that mold, I guess. And so I think, obviously, I know you sit in a hard position, and you're obviously supportive of our students, and we saw that in the marches that we've had here. But just in the future, we would like to see the capability of making sure that these rules that have been created don't ever restrict our free speech and the fact that we are able to have these certain intentional disruptions for educational purposes, if that makes sense.
I hear you.
But yeah, I'll let Vic
Also, just piggybacking on your question, I'm also just curious because if you look at campus protests, oftentimes occupying an administration building is an effective strategy of getting heard. In terms of if that were to occur under this new policy, who is the deliverer of punishment, if you will? Like, who determines that?
If there's
what's the appropriate punishment for these students who have violated an aspect of this law?
Well,
policy?
If you're occupying a building that prevents people from being able to do their job, that would be a violation. But if you're sitting and protesting and demonstrating and sharing your concerns, and it's not disrupting operation, then that's not a policy violation. And so if the question is, if there is a policy violation, that does report to me for students. If there's a policy violation, it's not really intact for faculty, but that would go to faculty affairs. And so, but again, as I stated, each situation is very different, and it has to be based on what the actual violation is related to the policy. And we're talking about the disruption of normal operations is what it sounds like that we're really asking.
I think the last thing I'll say, and I'll leave it here, is just I appreciate your comments, and I take them into consideration. I just think that in terms of all of this that we're trying to do here, right, we are marching for very important topics, obviously, and we've talked about immigration, budget cuts, wildfires here in California, all these important topics, right, that people had to bring to the table. And all of this was brought to the table because they are disrupting these students' lives. And so we cause a small disruption here on campus, but think of how much disruption, how much destruction occurs in these students' life that is affecting their education outside of this one march that we have, right? And so I think we have to look at it maybe through that lens of look at how much is being affected for these students' education And here we are trying to bring awareness to that. And so that's where I'll leave it.
Thank you so much, Marcel.
That's okay. It's fine. It's fine. So my question is, okay, so ever since the march happened, we got a lot of feedback from students, faculty, but mostly students leaders, because they would like to do the same that we did last time for their own communities. So basically, they don't know how to start this, speaking up for the community. And one of the main concerns is about how is the time, place, manner applying in the community. So I would like to know if there's like a form or like a way to send up feedback from students so we can, apport some feedback, in case we want to make some changes into this policy. Yeah.
Well, I don't want to sit here and be the, defensive administrator. It is the first time I'm hearing that there were concerns related to the march and that there was some barriers or pushback from people who reported to me that it was great and wonderful. But if that's not what's happening, we need to talk about it, because I don't think there's anybody here, administrators, faculty, staff, students, who are not committed to protecting our students, and I'm speaking just for students, but faculty and staff's also rights to free expression. And your demonstrations of the concerns that are happening in this community and to our students and to our families and to our faculty and our staff it's difficult and tough and not okay. And so for you guys to be speaking up against it from this administrator, I'm proud of you. So if there's concerns, let's talk about it.
Great. Thank you. Also, is there a way that we can, like I said, submit any feedback for upcoming changes, probably?
Related specific to the policy or to our processes? Or both?
Yeah, both.
I think I need to find out if that that open opportunity is still available. I don't know if anybody knows that. There used to be a link that people could submit feedback on the policy. And to the point of the processes, I think we as an institution needs to get together and discuss how it's impacting our campus community and what we can do to ensure everybody's rights are valued and heard.
Yeah, so right now it's still interim, which means it's not finalized. And I don't know exactly what the steps are between this interim and the final.
So it's not finalized for those who have to go through a union process to ratify. I think Lori is next to a mic, so I look to her for help with this. But it is intact, my understanding, for our students.
Okay.
And our MPPs.
Okay, important distinction.
Protected, not protected by you.
Yeah. Antonio, you were going to say something, right?
I just wanted to add that I think this conversation right now kind of highlights the fact that we really do need to have shared governance and talk about these issues together, and then also increase the education to our students. I mean, I know these student leaders pretty well, and they're involved and they have a pretty good pulse on the climate on campus. And if they're struggling interpreting this policy, I can't imagine what it means for the regular student.
Yeah, good point. I don't think that one's working. I'm sorry.
I just wanted to say a couple things. Thank you to all of you. Dr. Ault, you're reminding me of my political science days as an undergrad many, many years ago, and I love this stuff. So I would like to make a comment on some of the things that have been said. Emily is right. It is not yet in place for faculty and staff who are in bargaining units. It is in place for students and managers. But I think one of the things that my experience, right, has been the commitment of care of this administration, right, of wanting these things to be successful. And so if the feedback is that it didn't go as well as we maybe thought it did, then we do want to hear that, right? And you know, you have a policy, and then you have 23 campuses that maybe think something a little bit different. And so I think one of the really special things in my experience about our campus is that our engagement with those groups is attempting to help those efforts be successful in a compliant way, right? But I wanted to ask the question, particularly of Dr. Ault, right? This concept of the public limited and non-public spaces is not new, right? I mean, this is dates back many decades and court cases. So can you maybe talk a little bit about and you know, give all of us, and myself included, a refresher in where that comes from and how that has been defined in court cases over the course of the last 40, 50 years. Oh, summarize. And whether that's been a good thing or
With
not.
citations.
Yeah.
And not being a legal scholar myself, I would say that these issues really do come out of an era post World War II, and I think that in this country there has been, and this ties back even further. So this is why I'm laughing, because we could go back to the creation of the modern state in the 1600s, and the idea of public and private spaces existing, and having those as distinct. And so without going there, in terms of this country, I think you see the idea of limited public spaces, protected spaces, spaces that, for whatever reason, you know, children in kindergarten, you know, well, is that a space that anyone should be able to enter? No, and that's distinct from, say, a storefront that may be selling to children, if that's their target audience, or parents of children, you know, where that's a public space. So even though they serve similar purposes, they're very different conceptions of our physical space around us. And some have protections and others have different protections. So in terms of the private space, I think that the private space is something that we have been debating in dialogue and as a community of human beings for thousands of years. And whether or not that existed was a debate for many years. And so having, at least in our context, say, moved beyond the recognition of a public and private space, again, it's a question of how do you interpret that? How does society regulate and oversee those? And I think that a policy like this, given the issue of freedom of speech, which in this country has, you know, very protected rights and very protected history to it, and it's a designated concept that, you know, and we see this through Supreme Court cases, that unless there's a really compelling reason, you know, we have to assume things are open and freedom of speech. So the burden of proof, and I think we see this in other rights in this country, but I think with freedom of speech, you really see this, that the burden of proof is on the one who wants to constrain.
Yeah.
You know, not necessarily the one who wants to speak. And that is something that I think, unfortunately, in the past couple of years, we've seen in this country, and this is under a Democrat, you know, under President Joe Biden's administration, with the concerns of, you know, anti-Semitism being perpetuated on campuses, that you saw sort of a movement toward a resolution of what that speech can be. And as I said earlier, we're going to see that shift or that push. We'll see where the courts end up on this in 2025, 2026, going forward. But the history of those court cases sort of puts it in those terms that it is a protected speech right.
Yes, and then balancing that with order and safety and feeling safe on campus. It's just
And we know that common knowledge. You can't yell fire in a crowded theater.
right, exactly. Yeah.
And there's a reason for it, because it endangers other people's lives. You can't threaten, holding a sign threatening a particular person. But now how do we determine that? Well, what is if it's a threat, as I mentioned earlier, death to fascism, or F the administration. If someone stands up with a sign like that, is that going to then have to go through some kind of process where we find the right language that, and we end up with a sort of bureaucratic slogan as opposed to a passionate political speech, as they oftentimes are.
Just imagining that. Take a moment.
So we'll take on that challenge. Right?
We have another question. Okay.
So when I first read the TPM policy, I understood disruptions as physical disruptions, like being too loud or blocking off an entranceway. But you guys have described it as signs being disrupting, as in emotionally or like as that. So I was curious, is it that way as well, or is it only physical disruptions?
Great question.
Probably in a better position.
Well, that was one of the questions, like who defines what is disruptive and what is?
There was also comments that made about signage also and posting, and the campus does have a posting policy, as you guys are probably well aware of it. And it is definitely determined that it's content neutral, right? You can't determine what, as we've talked about though, there are times where if it's inciting violence or if it's discriminatory harassment or something protected under the non-discrimination policy, right, where there can be some objections to it. But when you think about, I'm just trying to think about a specific example of how signage in particular, TJ, that's your question, right? How signage particular could be disruptive. I don't know. Maybe if, you held up a sign right now that said F the administration in front of my face and I couldn't talk to anybody, like, could that be considered by normal people to be disruptive to this event in particular? Perhaps. So I just think, again, it really depends on situations. It's very hard to use this one stop, and we wouldn't necessarily say you violated by the sign itself, because F the administration I don't think is necessarily citing in violence unless it said F Emily Poole and she should die, right? Which is inciting violence or direct threat to my safety. But I think the disruption itself of not being able to continue on this event as it was intended to do, that could potentially be disruption. I hope that answered.
And I think it's important to note, too, regardless if it's F the administration or F the faculty, it doesn't matter. And I think what we've seen on campuses over the years is the disruptions being, people who've been invited to speak at campuses. And for whatever reason, that person has sort of raised the ire of a segment of the student body, and that person either not being able to speak, being shouted down, being forced to leave, those sorts of things. And again, I think, it's understandable given some of the views that are out there. But the thing with freedom of speech that is, again, kind of the unique aspect of us is that, unless it meets a very fine line of criteria, it should be allowed. And the way you defeat those ideas is by allowing them to speak and then presenting the argument, the counter, and showing how idiotic or stupid or ridiculous or hateful or how potentially dangerous their speech is. So.
Yeah, it's kind of a thing where we're going to have to wait and see how this plays out. And hopefully it's something that we continue talking about and that we learn about these important cases, that hopefully they're not all just done privately, and we can learn how things are applied so that we can go forward in as fairly as we can and safely as we can. So, all right. So I don't think we have any more questions. So thank you everybody for, oh, we do have a question. I didn't see you over there. Okay, this can be our last question and then we'll wrap it up.
So this is more of a comment than a question.
Great.
I want to chime in on a couple of different things. Can everybody hear me right? Yeah. So first of all, the posting policy, chalking, things like that, that's not really aimed at content. It's aimed at making the campus not look like a mall because people were getting really out of control for a while. So when student organizations or any organization wants to make posters and put them up on campus, we've got a limited number of spaces there that will let us do things that are approved by us, and they're approved by us by quantity, not content. So you can come in with 13 posters. They're put a sticker on there with the date when the posters come down, which is 2 weeks in the future, to keep the place from getting overwhelmed with posters. And then we send the people out to go put the posters up. So I don't know of any occasion where we said, hey, this content is not appropriate, you can't put this poster up. I don't know of a single one when that's happened. Concerning the free areas for students, I'm going to use ASI for an example here. ASI is our major student government. They're elected by the entire student body. They're funded by student fees. And we give them permission to make decisions on students' behalf of how that money is spent to bring content for the students. And so ASI has runner hour every Wednesday for an hour at noon. And they have the student union patio, and they have it all the time. So they made the decision to spend the money that it costs to rent that space so that they could do their event. So is it fair for somebody else who was going to have a march to decide that they were going to have a march right then when this group looked ahead, planned it, paid for it, and are out there orchestrating it, for someone else who didn't do any of that to just come help themselves to the space? So that's partly what that system is in place for. I am the student organizations coordinator, so I oversee all the clubs, and I'm also the scheduler for student union spaces, so I get both barrels from both directions. But I also look at what other colleges are doing, and I can tell you that there are state universities that require 4 weeks lead time. There are state universities that require 8 weeks lead time. There are some that require you to submit your calendar before the school year starts, and you are stuck with that calendar. You might move it a day or two depending on the availability of the space, but otherwise you're committed to that. And so that's a way for them to make sure that those spaces are being used as much as possible. One other thing I wanted to say about the 25 Live thing. Have you ever seen the people that have tattoos on their wrist of a semicolon? You know what that means?
Yes,
Pause,
absolutely.
right? Stop and think about it. That's what the 25 Live thing does. It makes you not do things spontaneously, which you might do something that you regret, but it makes you stop and think about it. Okay, let's put some thought into this. What can we do to make this better? What can we do to make this safer? What can we do to better communicate our message? And having that pause leads to more organization and more thought going into an event. It also leads to not forgetting things that you wish you'd done, where if you'd have done them right at the moment, after the thing, you might have said, wow, I wish we'd have done that. We'd have thought about it if we'd have spent some more time thinking about it. So it's basically just a pause. 2 weeks is as little as you'll find anywhere. So I think that's a pretty good compromise to cross that line between spontaneity and between spending some time to reflect on your event.
Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and perspective. That definitely added to what we had. Oh, do you want
I
to?
was going to ask you a question if you don't mind.
Yeah.
You mentioned the signs, signage. Does that include, or let me say, again, it was unclear as I was going through the policy. Do signs include signs that could be carried at a rally that we're organizing?
If you're carrying a sign that's on your person, that is not part of the sign thing because you're not posting it on a building.
Okay, so only that are posted on.
Yeah.
Okay.
And if you were somebody that had something to communicate and you wanted to stand out there on the grass and say it, you don't have to be in 25 Live. You walk in, say it. I don't believe you're allowed to approach students. You just say it, and if the students are interested, they will approach you. But as far as carrying signs, you're welcome to do that. Wear a T-shirt, whatever you want.
Mm-hmm.
And so, on the waiting period, if you will, which I'm in favor of waiting periods when it comes to certain things like possibly weapons and purchasing of a weapon, because that moment of passion is critical potential life that we're talking about. Is speech, in your opinion, or in the opinion of the panel even, is speech sort of a similar threat? And should speech be seen as a potential threat?
I'm just speaking personally.
Yeah. No, and I don't mean to put you in official capacity.
Personally, as somebody that schedules spaces, I don't look at what's being said. I look at things like somebody's doing I guess I was going to have a petting zoo. Somebody could get sick from that. Somebody who's allergic, animals have disease. Those things need to be checked out by safety and risk, by university police. Does it need to be fenced? Do they need to sign waivers? That's the kind of stuff I'm worried about. I'm not worried about somebody saying the F word. By the way, if I ever run out of Fs, I know now to come to the library because they're all over the place. I'm not worried about that. Now, there are people that are. We have groups on campus that if they see something that they think could become inflammatory, they'll keep an eye on it, make sure questions are asked. I don't know of anybody ever shutting anything down. I know of one instance where somebody who was high profile was tried to be brought onto campus and ended up not coming, and my understanding was that was because they wanted a fee to be here, and at that point it was not free speech. And so the limits were able to be placed on that. That's all I know.
And then just again, because I'm unclear on this, people who come from off campus who aren't students but participate in rallies, is there any address on that? Because I think we've seen that in the past where people who aren't even students at the university who are protesting and possibly doing things that violate some of what we've been talking about.
I can't really speak to that. I can say that I know of a homeless gentleman that came into the student union every day for like 3 years. There were students that came up and said, we're scared to be in this guy's presence, but he had a right to be there. And so he was there. When I ran the Campus Gamers Club, we had probably 50% of our attendance at any one time was off-campus people. We were playing all kinds of games and not necessarily, inciting trouble or something like that. But lots of off-campus people. It was not just a student thing.
Wow. So much to think about now, you guys. So I thank you all for being here. Thank you to the panelists. And please help yourself. Grab some food on the way out if you're hungry still. All right, thank you.